welcome back, and again a special welcome to Diederik Samsom. And well, I think for the Dutch students, Diederik is quite well known, but for the foreign students, he might not be. So I'll tell you a little bit of his background, but maybe he can elaborate on that later if he wants. Diederik has been active in sustainability for all of his career, I guess, and he joined Greenpeace already as a volunteer during his studies in Delft, and worked there as a campaigner for quite a long time. I don't think, were you working there when the Brand Spar issue arose, Diederik, or did you join later?
It was actually my first assignment as a volunteer, getting seasick on that Brand Spar thing.
Okay. I don't know, but for us working on sustainability, the Brand Spar was the first time that an oil major was put down on his knees and doing something they didn't want to do at all due to the public uproar about what they were planning. And that was really a new one, and it changed the world and the relationship between NGOs and big companies considerably. So that was a big thing. Afterwards, you I believe, were CEO of a green energy supplier, small green energy supplier, but then you went into politics, joined the parliament, was political leader for the Socialist Party, and currently chief of staff for Frans Timmermans, and so also responsible for the Green Deal in Europe. And as you just said, you hardly slept due to working on that Green Deal and realizing an important new 55% target for the EU, which is impressive and very important, I believe. The floor is yours, Diederik. You just said you'll give a short presentation, then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A.
Yeah, let me give you first of all, thanks for having me, good to see you all, although I don't see you, which is the first major setback, because Zoom is not allowed by the European Commission, so I have to work via a few firewalls to get here, which means I can only see myself, which is, well, annoying, but you're getting used to it after 6 months of this, or even longer now. Yes, I'm a former student of the Technical University in Delft, studied physics, nuclear physics in the end. So at the end of the Mekelweg, there's that little dome with a little reactor in it. Actually one of the oldest reactors in Europe or even the world by now, but pretty safe because it's too small to even consider blowing up. And I had a professor, Professor Van Dam, was one of the last staunch pro-nuclear activists in the Netherlands. If you would have given him 2 bricks, he would have built a nuclear power station out of it. And here I was going to work for Greenpeace. So I had a fun last 2 years of my study, working with Greenpeace and with Professor Van Dam. Anyway, long story short, I got my thesis in the end and went off into the rest of the world. And now we are in the, I am in the European Commission working on a sustainable future. And let me give you some context of the Green Deal, because that's relevant for where we are now and also where we are going to, and especially for the opportunities and challenges some of you have when you want to start a company or going to innovate, invent incredible new stuff. The Green Deal started in a different era, in a completely different time, which is the pre-corona era, which is only a year ago, but it seems ages ago. But exactly a year ago today, by the way, so the first birthday of the Green Deal, the European Commission presented its European Green Deal. 1 week into the mandate, we had only started 1 week to underpin the fact that this was our major flagship project for the next years. And the Green Deal stood out from, let's say, normal environmental policies that you might see dozens of, especially coming out of Brussels. But this one was different, and it stood out in 3 ways. I think The first one was obviously its ambition. For once, politicians weren't settling for the lowest common denominator, the feasible, the pragmatic. No, this time we went for the urgency at hand, which is our climate crisis, our biodiversity crisis, and our pollution crisis. So hence the ambitious targets on all three of them. Climate neutrality in 2050, which is sort of in accordance with the Paris Agreement, provided that you do it right, but also the ambition to stop the loss of biodiversity. Because comparing apples to pears, the loss of biodiversity might even be a bigger threat to future generations than extreme climate change. And also the ambition to stop polluting, stop any further pollution of water, soil, and air. We have polluted enough. And those three ambitions were not taken separately. And that's actually the second part in which the Green Deal was different from normal environmental policies. Because what governments and governing bodies like the European Commission normally do is they have an idea and make a policy on energy, and then somewhat later on transport, and somewhat later on nature, and on agriculture, and on water. And not seldom they are conflicting with each other. To save climate or end biodiversity at the same time, you need to have a consistent, coherent plan. And that's exactly what we try to do with the Green Deal. Make one plan for one project. And that one project is saving our ecosystems for future generations. And if you come to think of it, it's actually pretty logical to do it that way, because there is only one ecosystem. We live in it, we live from it, and we should preserve it. And within that one ecosystem, everything is connected with each other, as we now endure, moreover, in this pandemic. And the third thing making the Green Deal different from normal environmental policies was that it actually wasn't an environmental policy at all. It is a growth strategy. It is an impulse, a new momentum to an aging continent, Europe. Aging in many ways, its people, its buildings, its industry. And it desperately needs new momentum. Also to preserve wealth for future generations, to provide new growth and new jobs and new opportunities to our children and grandchildren. And I remember receiving some flack for presenting an environmental strategy as a growth plan, because how on earth can you do that? Especially for my old buddies in the environmental movement. Some raised eyebrows were thrown at me, because environmental protection and economic growth are contradicting each other, aren't they? I beg to differ, and I still do. I think we can combine that, and actually combining them is the biggest challenge we have. Growing is not difficult. Preserving the environment is not too difficult. Doing both at the same time, that's the real difficulty. So here we were in December last year, and we went to work on all those ideas and all those elements of the Green Deal. And then March arrived, Corona arrived, and turned our world upside down. Completely, for everyone. People, European Commission, Green Deal, everything upside down. And I must admit that for a moment, I despaired a little, because I thought, here we go again. Haven't we been there before? At last, politicians muster some political guts, some audacity, and they develop a long-term vision, a dot on the horizon. And that happened before. But what also always happens after that is an urgency comes in, flies in, an event requiring all your attention, all your political capital, all your financial capital, and here we go. Dot on the horizon, away, plans in the drawer, dealing with the urgency at hand. Only 13 years ago, a former vice president who never became president, Al Gore, walked into Europe with a film, An Inconvenient Truth. And he mesmerized the European public, much more than the Americans, by the way, and also the European politicians. I remember op-eds in the Financial Times by Tony Blair, together with Jan-Peter Balkenende, by then the Prime Minister of the Netherlands. urging their fellow government leaders to step up to the plate because Al Gore had opened our eyes. Climate was the urgency for our next generation. This was our time. This was our moment, etc., etc. We should make a climate ambition our foremost goal, and it did. So they made plans and ideas, and they were put on paper. And then Lehman Brothers fell, and the world turned into the financial crisis, the economic crisis, the euro crisis, and we have never heard back from an inconvenient truth anymore. So it's quite a challenge to keep a long-term vision alive when there's an urgency coming in, and you could call Corona an urgency, the biggest one we've ever faced. So there was reason to despair, because this time it might happen again. Just after we presented the Green Deal with a lot of pride and bells and cheers, there was another urgency. All our capital, all our attention, all our political weight turned towards Corona, and and the Green Deal would end up in the lowest drawer that you can find. But this time that didn't happen. This time was different. Different because what actually happened, and what was indeed amplified last night, is that we put the Green Deal on steroids. We made the Green Deal our answer to Corona, to the economic crisis as a consequence of Corona. Because if you want to recover your economy, you better build back green instead of building back the old stuff and then starting to transition into a green future. It's logical. Still, politically, it's very rare. So I'm quite pleased that we were able to not only save the Green Deal, but actually put it on steroids, providing more public money, more momentum, and more ambition to a plan that was already quite ambitious and quite expensive. So why was this time different? And that's relevant also for you. I think there was a few things that were completely different from 13 years ago, when Al Gore and then Lehman Brothers led to the demise of the long-term plans for climate. First of all, the urgency in society. The young generation now is completely different from the young generation then. And as an old man, I can say that. Because what I see now happening around us is a young generation that isn't giving up on that long-term vision, because they know they will still be there in the long term, but also because they are much more aware of the urgency than we were. And they are asking their parents pertinent questions, small ones about eating meat or flying away on holiday, but also much bigger ones to their parents who happen to be in power. CEO of Daimler-Benz, high civil servant in the European Commission, leader of government. Hey, Dad, what are you doing to make my life, to make my future safe, to save the planet for my generation? And I can assure you, when the CEO of Daimler-Benz has a grumpy shareholders meeting, that's a bad day. But when the CEO of Daimler-Benz cannot answer his own children at the kitchen table, that's much more than a bad day. That's existential. And that changes the world. On an optimistic note, the world is changed at the kitchen table much more than it is in boardrooms and parliaments. So that was one difference. And the other difference is that Europe is much better in working together. If you remember the Euro crisis and the pictures, and maybe the most symbolic one, the non-handshake between Jeroen Dijsselbloem, Eurogroup chair by then, and Yanis Varoufakis, the flamboyant Minister of Finance of Greece, that was basically the metaphor for not cooperating. And by not cooperating, the solution got much more expensive. Now we were able to cooperate. In July, 27 heads of state and government agreed on this package of 750 billion euros to recover the European Union from the Corona crash. Now we reiterated it last night, and on top of that, we agreed on an ambition of minus 55% CO2 reduction, which is doubling the effort compared to the old ambition of -40%. But the most important difference from 10 years or 13 years ago and now is technology. If you look back, the first decade of this century was really deplorable in many ways. I mean, it started with 9/11 and it ended with the financial crisis. So a bad mood, but also for technology, it was really bad. Actually, the only technological invention that the first decade of the century has delivered us is this smartphone thing, which is pretty important, but for sustainability, hardly relevant. Solar panels in the first decade of the century became more expensive. Offshore wind is going absolutely nowhere. And the electrical car, you could get to the garden gate and then it was empty. And it looked like, well, crap. So now 10 years further, only 10 years, which is in energy terms actually one day, only 10 years, we've seen solar energy going through a mind-boggling cost curve downwards. We've seen the huge success of offshore wind, and we've seen the automobile industry turned upside down by one crazy American, which sometimes you need those guys, and completely going into another direction. Not just taking a small corner, no, really going off the cliff of the internal combustion engine into electrical mobility. And that's happening right now under our eyes. Is that enough to be optimistic? Nowhere near enough. So my encouragement toward you is actually make the third decade of this century even more spectacular in terms of innovation, because we need much more than this. We need hydrogen production at cost levels that are basically similar to what solar energy just reached in the last 10 years. We need solid state batteries, or even the generation after that. We need fourth or fifth generation solar cells. We need mega windmills also on land, not in the Netherlands, but there's quite some pieces of land out there in the world that you could put those 12 megawatt or 15 megawatt windmills on, but how to get them there? We need innovation. We need new companies working on spectacular findings that we couldn't think of just now or the last 10 years. Also in renovating our houses, which is a cumbersome activity, requiring a lot of work, requiring a lot of hassle. And where's the paint that can do the same thing as 9 centimeters of rock wool? I'm sure it's there, somewhere out there, in the mind of a brilliant young man or woman. Let's put that into practice. We make the policy. We will continue doing so. -55 is now on the table. We will make the legislation to make that happen, leading to increased prices for CO2 emissions, leading also to new regulation, pushing the world into that sustainable pathway. But we need something to push. We need new innovations and new inventions and new business models to come on the market and prove that -55 is actually possible, while containing or even increasing our economic growth and our wealth, and obviously our well-being. So please continue with your work, and we are going to do everything to make that work more successful. The European Commission is not the best venture capitalist or incubator, but we can provide the incentives to make that, to help incubators, to help venture capitalists to steer private money into sustainable challenges. So let's do this together. That will be my final plea to you. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Diederik, and an impressive step indeed. I had the same fear when we got into the Corona crisis. What's going to happen now? But it was really tremendous how fast politicians from all sides realized that we were going to have to do it in another way than we did in 2008. So that's really good. To the whole group, I'd like to ask, we have some questions in the chat, but add them, please do. And I'll go into the first question, which is a prickly one immediately for you, Diederik. A lot of applause for the steps being taken also last night. But then again, they look at, okay, what's happening, for instance, in the agricultural industry and especially in the meat industry. So there's still EU-funded marketing telling us to eat more meat.
Yeah.
And that kind of thing that if you were talking about the integrated policy, is that working?
Yeah, isn't that embarrassing?
Yeah.
Yes, and it is, and it should end fairly soon. To give you the broader context, as you might know by now, I'm pretty optimistic about technology and the way we can preserve our wealth while becoming sustainable. There's only one big worry, and that's our diet. Indeed, if every world citizen starts to eat like Europeans, let alone Americans, we need a second planet, and we don't have one. So either we solve that also with new technology beyond meat and the likes, or we cut down on our meat diet. And the latter being actually very easy if you set yourself to it. And basically also there, the young generation is steering us into that direction. There's so many of my fellow friends and acquaintances who tell me sometimes with a heavy heart that their children have become vegetarian too. But after a while, you speak them again and they say, well, now I'm a vegetarian too, because otherwise it's too cumbersome to cook 2 meals all the time. And it's actually not bad. Anyway, how to get there? Not by promoting meat all the time. So what we are facing in the European Commission is a particular challenge, especially for Europe, because that common agricultural policy, which has been there since the beginning of the Union, 1957, and was always a big beast within the European Union. Actually, it was 60% of the budget for a long time. It's now back to 30% of the budget, but it's still a super tanker. And actually, somewhere in the 60s, that super tanker went off, and we never saw it back. It's there, it's providing farmers with an income, and it doesn't take care, doesn't mind what the rest of the world is actually doing. In the 60s and the 70s, that led to huge overproduction. Now it doesn't lead to huge overproduction anymore. Now it leads to huge environmental damage. And we need to change that. So one of the particular challenges that I have as head of cabinet of the Green Deal Commissioner, being responsible to put all the frogs in one basket, is to get that huge frog out there, which is the Common Agricultural Policy, and put it into the Green Deal basket. We're working on it. We will need the next 5 years to make some progress with it. But I'm also there, I'm optimistic. And one example of that is we just agreed on the new budget for promoting our agricultural products, because part of producing too much is obviously now you have to desperately try and sell it somewhere in the world. From that promotion, 50% used to be meat promotion, exclusively meat promotion, and now that's down to 20%, which is still not zero. But okay, step by step, we're getting there.
Step-by-step process. One comment here is, let's become beefitarians, which is a start at least. It's true. Related to this question is the public awareness on climate change. You just said, and I believe you're right, that especially the youth is very concerned about climate. But if you look at the public in general, and also in Eastern countries, in some Southern countries, this awareness is a lot less. What can you do about that?
Well, first of all, the awareness amongst the younger generation is huge across the board, up to Bulgaria, or even Croatia, which is furthest out. So I'm optimistic about the next 10 years, provided that the young generation doesn't lose its interest and starts to become rich, etc. But again, there is such a huge difference between my generation and the generation now, from today. when I studied, and as I explained, I studied nuclear physics. Well, obviously, no work in nuclear physics in the Netherlands, nor for my fellow students. I think we were in total 25 in that last year of physics. 20 of them went to work for McKinsey or Shell, and obviously one sucker went to Greenpeace. But the rest was really into going for money. And now it's completely different. The biggest problem of Shell nowadays is not their fight with the environment movement. Since the bread spa, they know how to do that. It's not about oil reserves being there or not. They will find some new ones if necessary. No, the biggest problem of Shell nowadays is that young people don't want to work there anymore. And that is changing the world. And that's worrying Shell to a large extent. So that young generation, although it's indeed not steering the wheels right now, it is already influencing the people steering the wheels, and it will steer the wheel in about 10, 15 years time, including in Poland. When I worked before I went to Brussels, I had 2 years of, let's say, freedom at hand, having left Dutch politics, and I went to work for all kinds of things, including venture capitalists who wanted to make money, but in sustainability for once. So I traveled across Europe looking for the new opportunities of startups and scale-ups that you could buy on a cheap price and then increase their market value. And you know where I found most of them? In Eastern Europe, in sheds in Warsaw or Gdansk or Prague or Bratislava. Young engineers, chemists working on things like perovskite, the holy grail of the new solar cell, or other mind-boggling ideas. And indeed, more frequent in Eastern Europe than around here, which is counterintuitive. But if you come to think of it, the economy in Eastern Europe is more dynamic, the people are younger, and there's more technical engineering than here, relative to management and law and psychology and all the other studies that you could do. So the circumstances are much better than you might superficially think, making me, again, pretty optimistic.
Glad to hear, Diederik. And look where the sucker that joined Greenpeace is now. So they wouldn't have expected it then, I guess.
No.
Definitely not. A question on Tesla. You mentioned Tesla as improving the electric cars. How's the amount of credit for driving innovation divided between Tesla and the EU's 95 gram CO2 fleet average policy?
I'm not sure whether I understand that question exactly.
I have the same problem. I hoped you would. You would.
Let's see what I can read here. I can read things, but I'm not sure where that question was. But we will have. Hold on. How's the amount of credit for driving innovation divided? Yeah, but well, basically, as I said, the 95 gram fleet average policy is way too lame at the moment. We will go. I mean, that's the current standard for today's cars, today's car fleet, basically on average. We were anticipating going down to about 60. So a minus 37% compared to the 95 grams. We now know with the new target that we just agreed on a few hours ago that we need to go to a minus 50%, which will end you up below 50 grams per kilometer. And for an average fleet to have that emissions, a car manufacturer needs to be able to provide at least 50, 60, or maybe even 70% of its cars electrical as an electrical vehicle. So what we will see in the next few years, and Tesla was the catalyst for that, because Elon Musk proved that it is possible, not only making better batteries and better cars, but also developing a business case, although he's just starting to make money. Was a cash burner for a long time, but still he proved what was possible, and we now see the big OEMs like Volkswagen and Audi and Mercedes to do the same thing. And Volkswagen will put 22 electrical models on the road in the next year. So far, those new cars are more expensive to buy and cheaper to drive. So the full cost of ownership is actually for an electrical car is actually competitive with its gasoline brother. The problem, obviously, for everyone, including the Dutch, or especially the Dutch, is that if it's cheaper, if it's more expensive to buy, you tend to buy the cheap one, which is the internal combustion engine brother. But that will change. We anticipate that within 2, 3, maybe 4 years, it's difficult to predict the future, but in that time frame, electrical cars will get cheaper to buy, let alone to drive, because that's already cheaper. So, and I can guarantee you that, especially in the Netherlands, it will go berserk by then. People will all buy electrical cars because, well, they're cheaper to buy, cheaper to drive, and in the Netherlands, you never drive more than 500 kilometers anyway. So we are the most suitable country to make this happen. You will see a bonanza of electrical cars, and I expect that the threshold of 50 grams per kilometer will be easily met even before 2030.
Okay, good to hear. The other question is on carbon neutrality for the EU and the Netherlands. Is it included in the Green Deal? What's the timeline?
Carbon neutral or climate neutrality, as we say, because carbon is not the only greenhouse gas, but climate neutrality has to be reached by 2050 for the European Union as a whole, which means the Netherlands will get there a little sooner, not that much. So it's basically somewhere around between 2045 and 55, but by then the world might look completely different, or will look completely different. And we're now planning just on that. Our more important goal, as I said, is the 2030 milestone, because that's where the investment cycle is right now. I mean, you need to invest now in order to meet that goal in 2030. And to be honest, for some investments, steel-based chemicals, you already need to invest now, or at least pretty soon, in order to be climate neutral in 2050. So it's not irrelevant that we put that dot on the horizon, but more prominent and more pressing is the goal for 2030.
Okay. And then getting back to the innovation, how will the EU or institutions help funding green technology innovations? Will they co-fund, co-invest together with venture capital?
I would also almost say, if you want to be a successful startup or scale up or being agile and innovative, the last thing you want is the European Commission on your back, because that comes with a heavy load. It's taxpayers' money, and you cannot just spend taxpayers' money. It's risk-averse money. So you cannot just take risks with that money, which is sort of paradoxical with what you need for innovative startups. So we found a way around it and created InvestEU, which is our own investment institution. The Netherlands now has a national version of it, which is InvestNL. And InvestEU teams up with private money, including venture capital, and starts to push that money into the market. Semi-successful at the moment, maybe very successful soon, but I do think that the added value of European money is when technologies are market-based or almost market-ready, and that's where we come in. If you need large chunks of money at not too high risk. That's where we come in. So basically, you will find European Union money more at the steel factory wanting to become climate neutral, requiring about 2 to 3 billion euros in one investment project, than having an innovative scale up for smart technology at home, requiring a few €100,000.
Okay, thanks. Another question, it's on the climate skepticism in Europe. How do you convince the skeptics? Is that the right word, skeptics?
Yeah, the skeptics.
Yep. Skeptics, yeah. To believe in the Green Deal as well. And of course, you've done that last night, because there are some countries that are definitely not convinced about.
Yeah, we just bribed them.
You buy them.
To be honest, no. Solidarity is a large ingredient, obviously here. So some countries are wary of going onto an ambitious road towards climate neutrality, not because they hate it, but because it's expensive and they have other things at hand, and their economy is not that mature yet. It's logical that they say, okay, let's share the effort and let's share it with as much solidarity as we can find. Well, here we are as a union. That's our job, our daily business. So again, what we decided on last night is that -55 goal will be shared among the member states in a solidarity, with solidarity as the main principle. And we can use all kinds of instruments and policy levers for that. The ETS, the emission trading system, is obviously our main engine, and is providing an enormous wealth of opportunities, because you collect incredible amount of money into tens of billions and up to hundreds of billions of euros. And part of that is obviously needed to pay the bills, but also you could also share a part of that with countries that are less able to pay for this transition themselves. The just transition is a motto that we enshrined into the Green Deal, front and center. We are convinced that this transition has to be just, or there just will not be a transition. Yellow vests are always the metaphor for that, and I hate it, but it's a correct metaphor. People will not accept a transition that will increase inequality. And to be fair, every transition actually has a tendency to increase inequality, because the ones with the opportunities and the money are the first to be able to jump on that transition towards a new future, and off they go, leaving behind the ones that are not able and willing and think their life is pretty complicated without climate change. And that is a huge risk that we are running right now. Normally, in normal transitions, let's say the first industrial revolution, which was the invention of the steam engine, we saw exactly the same happening. Ended with a lot more money and a lot more power for few people. And then we repaired the damage afterwards. The social movement, social democratic parties, and to be honest and fair and a little biased, Europe did quite a good job in that. We are a pretty fair continent, but we cannot afford to do that again. The transition is too big, the population is too large, and the inequality is already too big.
Yeah, and I think what you said earlier is that it is indeed a growth policy, and no one is against growth policies. There's a lot of money going in there, and it's growth. And some banks have actually calculated that a growth policy towards a low climate and a renewable system is much more efficient, much more growth in that, less costs, than going on in the way we are doing at the moment.
Yes, completely true. Although there's also a difference between this transition, industrial revolution, and the former ones, because the former ones were by itself a jump into wealth. So the industrial revolutions brought an incredible extra wealth into the society, enabling us to repair damage socially. This one is not self-evident that it will jump you into a new level of wealth. We are already incredibly rich. So it's much harder to acquire new wealth and use that to redistribute the social inequality. And that also is the bigger challenge compared to the past. You can also bring that back to a more concrete example. The dash for gas in the Netherlands, putting all the households from their coal pit to a gas connection, was for all households a jump into the 21st century in 1958, mind you. So everybody was cheering and applauding that. Nobody was against it. Now we are in a new transition from gas to something renewable, also for households, and it's not by itself a jump into the 22nd century, not by any means. The house gets a little more comfortable, but not that much. So you have a lot more resistance because it doesn't sell itself.
Okay, thanks. We went into it during the break to this subject, but the best incentive for many people is money. How do we speed up carbon pricing? What is the ideas on that?
Well, that's a very simple formula. If you increase the ambition and lower the amount of allowances from -40 to -55, you create more scarcity and therefore increase the price. Economic theory in practice. So that's what will happen. I want to also, in connection with the discussion we just had, is just increasing prices is for economists is basically heaven on earth. That's when things are happening, and it's true. But increasing the prices of CO2 will disseminate into everything: products, energy, cars, etc. So we'll raise prices for households, and as soon as you hit the front door of low-income households, you also hit the wall of political space, because that's where your political space ends, to increase prices even further, and for good reasons. So we also need other instruments. We will not get rid of regulation and other types and subsidies in order to manage this transition through the whole of society. My job would be a lot easier if economic theory would pay off in practice for 100%. Unfortunately, it doesn't.
Okay. Then getting back to the scale-ups, and the European Commission stimulates innovation through funds, but are there also other instruments in place, for instance, providing infrastructure to promising projects to link up with experts in the field of where they're working on? So how do we create this ecosystem of knowledge and innovation? What kind of things are working on that field?
Yeah, but you are the experts on that. Actually, we should intervene as little as possible into that. An ecosystem of innovation is also kind of a holy grail, and there's no blueprint for that. How do you create that? I think it's trial and error practice, and some very successful. I think well, much to the despair of Delft, Eindhoven was for a long time much more successful with that than Delft was, and Delft is catching up pretty rapidly, but still it's quite difficult. And as a European Commission, we should provide the, let's say, enabling environment or something like that, but steer clear of all too much intervention in that. A wise man once said that the recipe, the secret of innovation was very good coffee. Because at the coffee machine in an institution, people of different specialities and knowledge meet each other and start talking about the problems they have in their daily work in their laboratory. And with the cross dissemination of that knowledge, where one person says, hey, that idea, I've solved that a week ago somewhere here. So I thought the metaphor was striking. A very good coffee machine where people meet. Well, you cannot simulate that with policy from the European level.
And the big issue now is that we don't have coffee machines anymore, at least not a coffee machine where we convene.
To be honest, I think that is really one unseen consequence of this Corona time. I mean, we all talking about students being lonely in their room, which is true and deplorable, etc. But you're all young and visual people, so you will get there. But the problem is more that you miss that unwritten type of interaction with each other to inspire each other. So this might be a year lost for innovation. Well, not completely lost, because in your own confinement you can think of the most beautiful things. I think Einstein developed his theory of relativity in his own writing room study, but still, you need each other to make things happen.
We are actually developing virtual coffee machines now because you need them.
Yeah,
the interaction within companies too.
Yeah, no, it's true. But what do you drink digitally?
Beer, generally.
Yeah. I can see that. Yeah.
Then, as a former nuclear science student and Greenpeace activist, what's your idea on nuclear energy now? Of course, it pops up all the time. Again, in the Netherlands recently, with well, I might say quite a bad report backing it. But
well, but that's all politics. If you look at the technology itself, I mean, I'm an optimist about technology, you might know by now. And then if you're an optimist about technology, you cannot be selective. You cannot say, okay, solar panels will go all the way and nuclear will go nowhere. Because why? And nuclear could go all the way too. Nuclear is a sad story, basically starting in the 70s, when the nuclear industry, for good reason, thought that scaling up was the solution to bringing costs down. Again, economic theory. But that, well, while it did happen, it created unmanageable other problems of safety, waste, and society, etc. And that wasn't predictable, but it happened. And the nuclear industry didn't have much choice than just to embark on an even bigger project. So in answer to projects that failed, they developed the European pressurized water reactor, which is 1600 megawatts, and then another one which is even 2 gigawatt, in order to make this happen. And in a society that gets more wealthy, people are less risk prepared. They're more risk aversive, and that, let's say, battle was lost by nuclear. It's literally happening right now in France, where that European pressurized water reactor is built in Flamanville, somewhere on the coast of Normandy. And while they're pouring the concrete, they get a message from the regulators that there's another meter needed, because regulation is moving forward, and new stricter safety compliance needs to be met. And that project is basically collapsing under its own weight. They started building in 2004 and wanted to be ready in 2012. It's still not finished, and it's quadrupled in costs. I do think there is a way out for nuclear, which is completely the other way, which is much smaller, building modular small reactors, maybe running on thorium, also providing partly an answer to the waste problem and at least an answer to the proliferation problem of nuclear weapons. So there is, in theory and also in practice, in laboratories, etc., there is a solution. If you look at the development curves, I think it's fair to say that that solution will arrive too late to solve the European energy problem, which is not a disaster. We can solve our problem with other sources of energy closer at hand, wind, waves, solar, etc. Nuclear might still play a big role because we tend to forget it, but south of Europe, there's a continent that will welcome 1 billion new people in the next 25 to 35 years. 1 billion extra people living in Africa, in hopefully a much higher wealth level than they're living right now. Cities like Lagos or Kinshasa, people hardly know where they are, will have 90 million inhabitants. 90 million inhabitants. There's actually not that much fantasy needed to know that to power that amount of people on such a small area, nuclear could be a solution. So there is a way out for nuclear, but the current way is, I think, a dead-end alley.
Okay, well, we will see. I see that it's almost 12:30.
Yeah, so I have
to leave us to further work on the deals you've made last night, which is very important. Normally you would get an applause, so we'll do that virtually because, well, I think everyone was quite impressed with what you told us and the way you answered the questions. We even got them in the chat that they were impressed by the way you answered some of these questions. So that's great. So thank you very much, Diederik. Good luck.
Okay,
working,
thank you all.
The way you're doing. And I guess we can stay here for a small time afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.